So today I'm going to do something a little bit different for the channel. I'm going to do Shakespeare, Richard II to be precise. Richard II is one of the history plays, it's one of the better history plays, and you can usually find it either as a printed manuscript or as a play somewhere near you, or one of the movie adaptations. It's quite popular with actors, particularly the title role, which we'll explore a little bit as we go along. So I'm going to run through the plot. I'll be quite quick, and I'll put scene and act numbers up so that you can see how it relates to the text if you have a copy. Now the play starts with something that's a little bit unspoken, but an Elizabethan audience would have been very well aware of, which is that Richard II was involved with the death of the Duke of Gloucester. Now that's important for the play as it starts, because in Act 1, Scene 1, two of Richard's nobles, Mowbray and Bolingbroke, they're squaring off, trading accusations. Particularly Bolingbroke is accusing Mowbray of embezzlement, but also of being involved in the death of Gloucester. Now Richard is a new king, he's shown as an ineffective ruler, and he would much rather that this altercation didn't take place. He doesn't want it coming to light that he was involved. But Shakespeare leaves all of that unsaid in its opening, so we don't know from the on-stage audience, the members of the court that are surrounding these two as they square off, who knows and who doesn't. But we assume that most do know, so it's all a little bit of a sham. We are then informed of this in Act 1, Scene 2, when John of Gaunt, who is of course Richard's chief advisor, but he's also Bolingbroke's father, he has a little soliloquy and then an exchange with Gloucester's wife, where he basically explains that he knows what's going on and he wonders what will happen if it all comes out. So then we move on, and Mowbray and Bolingbroke are preparing to duel. What's important to this is this idea of chivalry or knightly honour, in that it's believed that at the end of a duel the truth will be revealed. You know, these people are standing up for their honour, that the just man will win, God will fight on his side, he will win, the truth will be revealed. And of course that is the last thing that Richard wants. So at the last minute he steps in and he exiles them both. We then learn that Richard is a little afraid of rebellion in Ireland, where there's been a few skirmishes with rebels. John of Gaunt then dies, and Richard steals the land that should be Bolingbroke's, because Richard is shown as an ineffective ruler. He's bankrupting the country. We get this mostly through metaphor, through England being represented as a garden, and that garden is in poor health. And that's a consistent metaphor through much of the play. We then learn that Richard, in keeping with his idea as having like a fragile grasp on his power, he's revealed that he has no heir. And we learn then that Bolingbroke has returned against his exile, and that Richard is dithering in fighting the rebels in Ireland. So Richard's allies and his levied soldiers begin to desert him, and Bolingbroke meets with various disaffected nobles to try and build a power base of his own. He executes Bushy and Green, who are symbols of Richard's withering garden state, and then Richard does return. He learns the state of things, and he begs the land to lend him spiders and toads and stinging nettles to come to his defence. Probably not as useful as a couple of thousand fighting men, but that's the sort of king that Richard is. Richard and Bolingbroke then meet at Flint Castle in Wales, and Richard, seeing that he has no real choice, agrees to abdicate. Act 4 begins with Bolingbroke arranging a big scene in the court to secure his position, and he intends to support this by revealing the truth of Gloucester's death and Richard's part in it. The scene descends into farce, though, with all manner of accusations and challenges to duel. All the nobles are throwing their gauges at each other and demanding satisfaction. The clergy that Bolingbroke has brought to confirm his position instead, they say that Richard is the king, he's therefore God's agent, and beyond the accusations of mortals such as Bolingbroke demands then that Richard confess publicly, or he'll be executed rather than allowed to abdicate. It's at this point that Richard switches from being the ineffective and feminized ruler of the kingdom and becomes a tragic figure, which is part of why actors like to play him. So Richard has this emotional parting from his queen, who's allowed to live in exile in France, and O'Merle is caught up in a plot against Bolingbroke, which is discovered by his father, the Duke of York. Bolingbroke is caught bemoaning his son's profligate ways, and who knows, perhaps somebody will write a play about him in the future. But Bolingbroke actually pardons O'Merle when his mother begs for his life. Two servants overhear the king, though, and misunderstanding his words, they set off to murder Richard. And here again we see another part of why actors do like to play Richard II, and that is this enormous soliloquy that forms Act 5, Scene 5, and then Richard's almost heroic fighting of these murderers, which unfortunately for him is unsuccessful. Then in the final scene we see that the civil war is rumbling on. Bolingbroke learns of the murder of Richard and feels that it will curse him to have the king's blood on his hands, and he promises a pilgrimage to the Holy Lands just as soon as circumstances permit, which, if we've seen Henry IV, we know he never actually gets round to. So beyond perhaps Act 3, when Richard returns from Ireland and the scene where he begs these toads and spiders to come to his aid, probably the two most important scenes of the play are Act 1, Scene 1 and Act 4, Scene 1. They effectively divide Richard II into two sections. The first introduces Richard and marks the beginning of the end of his rule. Act 4 depicts his deposition and the beginning of Bolingbroke's reign as Henry IV. Because these scenes are quite similar, they invite comparison, and if you look at these two key scenes and the way they represent the characters and the concepts of chivalric or knightly honour, you can see how Shakespeare is starting to involve his audience in a debate around sort of contemporary humanist approaches and the concept that the king was God's appointed agent and as such not accountable to human authority, often referred to as the divine right of kings. The first hint of this we see in the stage directions. Both scenes begin in very similar ways. They're both trial scenes, they're both set in the court of the ruler of the kingdom, and both are more than they seem. Richard is trying to hide his involvement in the death of his uncle, the Duke of Gloucester, and Bolingbroke is hoping to legitimise his position by disparaging Richard's. Richard enters leading the important figure of his advisor and Bolingbroke's father, John of Gaunt, to the stage, along with various other courtiers, described in the stage directions as nobles and attendants. Similarly, Bolingbroke's entrance to his own court in Act 4 is described as enter as to Parliament. It's kind of a way of reinforcing that Bolingbroke is not technically the king. He can embrace the trappings of royalty, but he isn't actually royalty. And he does this to reinforce his position to those members of his retinue, the people who enter with him, and he establishes them as an on-stage audience to what he hopes will be a seamless coronation. In the stage directions, there's another key distinction. Richard's court is one of nondescript nobles and attendants, and we learn later on from Northumberland that Richard is surrounding himself with anonymous sycophants. The king is not himself, but basically led by flatterers. The absence of any specific named religious figures may also suggest that Richard is taking his divine right to rule for granted. Bolingbroke, by contrast, knows he requires the church's support to legitimise his reign, and he's accompanied by both the Abbot of Westminster and the Bishop of Carlisle. In further contrast to Richard's entrance in Act 1, Scene 1, the members of Bolingbroke's court are almost all specifically named. We have O'Merle, Northumberland, Percy, Fitzwater, Surrey, the Bishop of Carlisle, Abbot of Westminster, there's Herald, there's officers, and there's Bagot. The crowded nature of the stage in both scenes establishes them as being key to the play, and naturally also invites a comparison between them. The presence of the religious figures and Bagot will become a particular problem for Bolingbroke as Act 4 progresses. Bolingbroke opens Act 4 with the immediate implication of Richard in Gloucester's death. He says in line 4, "Who wrought it with the king?" His expedience in broaching the subject matter suggests a prior knowledge of what Bagot is about to say. Bolingbroke is hoping that Bagot's implication of both Richard and O'Merle in Gloucester's death will make his on-stage audience question Richard's reign. But Bagot was one of Richard's flatterers who, along with Bushy and Green, Bolingbroke referred to as the caterpillars of the Commonwealth. There's more of that England as a garden message in there. Bolingbroke had Bushy and Green executed with barely a trial in Act 3, Scene 1, and it seems plausible that Bagot only escaped their fate by colluding with Bolingbroke, questioning the legitimacy of the trial in Act 4. The nature of the trial in Act 1 is also highly questionable. Richard presides over an inquest he would prefer to brush aside. Bolingbroke accuses Mowbray of a number of crimes, including embezzlement, but it is his accusation that Mowbray killed the Duke of Gloucester that's causing Richard the most difficulty. As mentioned, an Elizabethan audience would probably already know that about Richard's involvement in Gloucester's death, but Act 1, Scene 1 circumvents the issue completely, whereas Bolingbroke immediately and explicitly states it in Act 4, which helps juxtapose the different constitution and methods of their courts. In Act 1, Scene 1, Bolingbroke and Mowbray are both high-ranking lords, while Bagot's accusation of O'Merle in Act 4 is complicated because he is not of noble birth. O'Merle claims that he would dishonour himself by even responding to Bagot's claim at all, and initially he addresses his response to the other more notable attendants and not Bagot himself. "Princes and noble lords, what answer shall I make to this base man?" he asks. The complications brought by Bagot's lowly status are a direct opposition to Act 1, Scene 1, where Bolingbroke feels that his high status might complicate his accusation of Mowbray and make him reluctant to take his gage. He insists, "I must lay aside my high blood's royalty." The significance of the noble blood is made even more explicit when O'Merle tells Bagot that his blood is all too base to stain the temper of my knightly sword. Both Mowbray and Bolingbroke are dukes, of course, significant figures in Richard's kingdom, and their duel, further complicated by the position of John of Gaunt as Richard's chief advisor, helps suggest that Richard's court is divided to the very top. In Act 4, Bagot's relatively low status, though, emphasises the comparatively base standard of Bolingbroke's own court, and combined with the absence of an old advisor figure such as John of Gaunt, it suggests that Bolingbroke's court begins a more modern era where superstitions like the divine right of kings and its underpinnings in the feudal systems of chivalry and knightly honour have lost some of their power. Despite their heated tempers, in Act 1, both Bolingbroke and Mowbray invoke the code of chivalry. Bolingbroke talks of all the rights of knighthood, while Mowbray responds with, "I'll answer thee in any fair degree of chivalrous design or knightly trial." This is markedly different to O'Merle's response to Bagot. O'Merle seems reluctant to answer Bagot's challenge, saying he would dishonour his fair stars by doing so. And of course, in the period depicted here, a nobleman could refuse to fight a low-born one. It certainly seems that O'Merle would be happy to do so. While Mowbray and Bolingbroke stood face to face, trading accusations, it is not until line 26 that O'Merle even addresses Bagot directly, and then he says, "There is my gage, the manual seal of death." It's a much more succinct and overtly violent statement than either Bolingbroke or Mowbray make. While Bolingbroke and Mowbray are both eager to duel, there is a sense that they are both concerned that their own actions be seen as just and honourable, and that they will engage in a genuine trial by combat. Bolingbroke insists, "I will make good against thee, arm to arm," and Mowbray responds, "Alive may I not light, if I be traitor or unjustly fight." Now Shakespeare uses rhyme less than usual in these scenes, so this line here takes additional significance. It may be that the use of the rhyme is intended to enhance the idyllic image of chivalric knights, or perhaps Shakespeare uses this more poetic phrase to indicate that Mowbray is more verbose than the forthright Bolingbroke. The importance of chivalry and honour is expanded further in Act 1, Scene 1, when Bolingbroke refers to his gage as "mine honour's pawn." He seems to be using a chess metaphor, suggesting that his gage is just a token or a tiny piece of a much greater honour. However, it's also possible to consider that Bolingbroke is referring to it as a debt, that his honour is held in question until the matter is properly settled. The significance of honour and chivalry in Richard's court, then, would seem much greater than Bolingbroke's later on, when O'Merle's statements to Bagot are openly disrespectful and seem to portray their duel as little more than him killing another man. So the similar structures of the two scenes enables audience to directly observe the difference between Richard's court and Bolingbroke's court. By doing so, they engage the audience in the debate between the nature of the divine right to rule and the opposing stance promoted in works such as Machiavelli's The Prince, that a leader can be created in more pragmatic or earthly ways. The spectacles of the scenes, the two men trading insults and accusations in front of their rulers, is highly dramatic. However, the on-stage audience is also key to both scenes. Bolingbroke's attendants represent both nobility and the lower classes, suggesting his kingdom is more grounded and practical, whereas Richard has surrounded himself with flatterers. The extreme contrasts of Bolingbroke and Mowbray's chivalric poetry, juxtaposed with O'Merle's disrespect to Bagot in Bolingbroke's court, also suggest that the concepts of honour and of chivalry have little place in the more modern world. Shakespeare takes no moral stance on this, making it clear that despite their different approaches, Bolingbroke will have no more success uniting a fractured kingdom than Richard did. That both these trials are effectively a sham reminds the audience as well that despite their very different approaches, both Richard and Bolingbroke are merely playing at being a ruler. So I highly recommend that you check out Richard II, especially if you can see it as a play that's faithful to the original manuscript. If not, perhaps one of the movies is available right here on YouTube. And failing that, of course, you can always just read the manuscript and let your imagination fill in the blanks. The history plays are all highly entertaining and much more accessible than you might imagine if you were forced into Shakespeare against your wishes as a schoolchild. And of course, Richard II leads into Henry IV, which then leads into Henry V, which is one of the very best of Shakespeare. So definitely check it out, and hopefully it will whet your appetite for the full. It's not really a trilogy because Henry IV comes in 2 parts, quadrilogy. If you've watched this video all the way to this point, then perhaps now is an appropriate moment to click like. And if you want to see more of Shakespeare, because like I said, this is not really something I do a lot of on this channel, then comment is the way to let me know. Or if you want to see less, same difference really. Anyway, thank you for watching. By all means, subscribe as well while you're here, and if you do, then you really ought to ring that bell, because otherwise there's not a lot of point in being subscribed due to the way YouTube works. Anyway, thanks for watching. See you in the next one.